In this series, we are turning to chapter 10 of the book, The Normal Christian Life, The Path of Progress, Walking in the Spirit. And after everything we have talked about in the previous series concerning the self-life and its fierce independence, the question now becomes very practical. If self cannot live the Christian life, then what does it actually mean to walk in the Spirit? Today I'm going to share with you the third of three thoughts that I have highlighted from this one section of chapter 10 of Walking in the Spirit from Watchman Nee's The Normal Christian Life. And this will close out this section today. And next week we will take 2 episodes to talk about the last section of this chapter. And I am very much looking forward to next week's episodes. So the first thing that I shared with you was this word consistency. The Christian life works best when we stop trying so hard to keep ourselves going and learn to depend on the life of Christ in us. The second thing I shared in the previous episode was Holy Spirit harness. Walking in the Spirit means learning to stay out of the way, paying attention to what Holy Spirit is doing and joining Him instead of taking over ourselves. And the third thought I want to share with you today are these 2 words, hypocrisy and playacting. Now, hypocrisy is an accusation that is often thrown at us by unbelievers. And what they usually mean is this: you say one thing and you do another, or you expect a standard from other people that you yourselves don't live by. And most of us have heard that sort of accusation before, and it has possibly been aimed directly at you. People listen to what we say, they watch how we live, and when those things don't seem to line up, the word hypocrite is usually not far behind. And that's normally what unbelievers mean when they use the word, and perhaps that's what you think too. But as I reread this section and took some time to dig a little deeper on this word hypocrite, I don't think Watchman Nee is using the word in quite the same way. And the word that keeps drawing my attention is actually the word playacting. The Greek word translated hypocrite is hypokrites. It's the same word. It's where we get our word hypocrite from. And before it ever became a religious word, it belonged to the world of theatre. It described a stage actor, somebody wearing a mask, playing a role, portraying somebody they were not. And as someone who has been in and around the world of theatre for decades, this caught my attention because for many years I have been the musical director for many big musicals. And for a year I taught drama as an acting head of drama, and I use the word taught in the loosest sense possible. But I know what happens long before an audience arrives, the months of evening and weekend rehearsals. And in schools, this is every available slot that you can find in the schedule, break times, lunch times, before school, after school. And then you are in constant planning meetings with the team and researching costumes, makeup, talking about the lighting, the staging. You're with the students talking and developing their characterization. And then for me, there was the band, which needs hiring and then rehearsing. And it's a ridiculous amount of work for normally a 3 or 4 night run of actual shows. An actor studies how a person would think, how they would speak, how they would behave. And then they become that person as soon as they step onto the stage. They actually become somebody else for a few hours. And they might break that during their downtimes when they're not in a particular scene. But for the most part, they are encouraged to stay in character so that they are in this characterization for the whole show. And honestly, I'm just going to leave this question here. Doesn't that sound so familiar in much of today's Christian culture? You spend enough time around church life and you soon work out how that culture operates. You begin to learn how to behave in that arena, what people expect to hear, what is likely to be well received, and what sounds suitable for the environment that you find yourself in. And before long, it becomes possible to give an expected answer without even stopping to consider where that answer is actually coming from. When Jesus uses the word hypocrite in Matthew chapter 23, he is speaking to men who had become experts at appearances. Matthew 23, 27, and 28 in the Amplified Classic, where Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, pretenders, hypocrites! For you are like tombs that have been whitewashed, which look beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of dead men's bones and everything impure. Just so you also outwardly seem to people to be just and upright, but inside you are full of pretense and lawlessness and iniquity." And the Pharisees knew exactly how the system worked. They knew the scriptures, they knew the traditions, they knew how to maintain a reputation for being so spiritual. And people looked at them and saw successful religious men. But Jesus kept bringing the conversation back to what was happening underneath all of that exterior and all of that pretending. This is why he used the word hypocrites, and Jesus applies it to men who had become very good at looking the part. Other people saw the performance and were, "Bravo, Pharisees, bravo." But Jesus was not in the slightest bit impressed by this theatrical display. And I can see in my mind the two old men, Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets, sitting in the balcony screaming, "It was awful." I know I'm making light of this, but it really is as serious as Jesus exposes it to be. In Luke 12:1, Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." A person rarely wakes up one morning and decides to become a hypocrite. It usually starts with something much smaller than that. We learn how to say the right things, give the expected answers, or behave in ways that we know those around us are going to approve of. And over time, it becomes possible to present an image, an appearance that looks like Christ while relying entirely upon ourselves to sustain it, to maintain it. But for a son, one who has been born from above and received the very life of Christ, I think the word hypocrite takes on a slightly different perspective. Paul writes in Colossians 3, 3-4, "For as far as the world is concerned, you have died, and your new real life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in the splendor of his glory." And notice the language that Paul is using here. He speaks of our new real life and then goes on to say Christ, who is our life. In other words, the self-life is no longer who we are because Christ has become our life. And that is why, whilst the world usually defines hypocrisy as saying one thing and doing another, for a son, hypocrisy can be understood as living in a way that is contrary to who you really are as the new man. It's thinking, speaking, and living as though the old self-life still defines you. When Paul says that life has died and your new real life is now hidden with Christ in God. But you are not your self-life, you are not your flesh, which I have said many times through this series. And you don't have to choose the mind of the flesh, because old patterns of thinking will lead to old patterns of behavior. So let's think about this word playacting, because for a son, playacting is putting the old costume back on and living as who you once were. Just think about that for a moment. An actor steps onto a stage and becomes somebody else, whereas a son has already become somebody else. He has been born from above. He has received the life of Christ. He has become a new creation, the new man in spirit, and one with Holy Spirit. Yet there are moments when he reaches back for the old costume and begins living as though the old life still defines him. And this is why Paul writes in Colossians 3, 8-10, "Now Put away and rid yourselves completely of these things: anger, rage, bad feeling towards others, curses and slander, and foul-mouthed abuse and shameful utterances from your lips. Do not lie to one another, for you have stripped off the old unregenerate self with its evil practices, and you have clothed yourselves with the new spiritual self, which is ever in the process of being renewed and remolded into fuller and more perfect knowledge upon knowledge, after the image, the likeness of him who created it. And so, did you hear the language that Paul is using here? You have stripped off the old self. You have clothed yourself with the new. Then a few verses later, he says in verse 12, "Clothe yourselves, therefore, as God's own chosen ones." And I think there's a reason why Paul keeps using this language and talking of clothing. He is helping us see that something very fundamental has changed. The old man is no longer who you are. He has died. And the self-life, the residue of the old man left behind in the soul and the body, is no longer who you are either. Everything that was attached to the old is now no longer you. Christ is now your life as the new man. So when Paul speaks about putting on compassion and kindness, humility and patience, he is describing the character of the life we have already received. He's describing what it looks like when Christ is being expressed, rather than self trying to imitate Christ. And so you could easily overlook a word like playacting when you're reading quickly, but Holy Spirit never misses what he wants to talk to you about. He is exposing every attempt to return to a source that no longer defines you. Every attempt to put the old costume back on, every attempt to think, to live as though Adam is still your source when Christ has become your very life. So to close out this week, Watchman Nee wrote, "There is too much hypocrisy in the lives of Christians, too much play acting. Yes, pretense gives way to a reality when we trust the law of life. The answer is Christ himself. For a son, hypocrisy is living in a way that is contrary to who you really are. And play acting is putting the old costume back on and living as though the old self-life still defines you. The reality is that Christ has become your life. You have been born from above. You have received his life, and you have become a partaker of something entirely new, a nature that you have never known before. And the more we trust that life within us, the less need there is to maintain appearances, because the Christian life was never intended to be a performance. It is Christ himself being revealed through those who have received his very life.